Boker Tov, everyone. Lovely to see you all today. So this week's Parasha is Shelach. Now, this Parasha is probably most famously known for what in English people call the sin of the spies, the Meraglim, which comes from the word regel, walking. So it could be translated perhaps as scouts. And there's some question about whether these men who are chosen to represent the tribes to go into the land of Canaan to scout out the land to see if it's worth conquering, whether these are professional military spies or if these are diplomats or if it's a mixture. There's a lot of mystery around what's going on. Some of the mystery is, would God have asked the people to do it if they hadn't been implying that they were having some doubts? Or did God want them to do this and want them to fail so that they could recognize that they were not politically, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and militarily prepared for it? Did God know that the people would turn on Moshe and God really and say, we're not ready for this, and need to wait 40 years before they could actually go into the land of Canaan to conquer it? There's a lot of mystery in the text, and there are classical commentators that imply both of those things, that the sin of the spies was unfortunately a necessary failure for the people, so that God would have perhaps an excuse to say, look, you guys aren't ready, but he needed them to see that for themselves. Because God obviously promised us the land, so why couldn't we just go in right away? But the thing I want to focus on today is not the sin of the spies, which we can discuss more on Shabbat, but rather one of the most important mitzvot in the Torah, at least according to the rabbis, is in this week's parasha, and that is of tzitzit. And today, there are many Jews, particularly men, but we'll talk about that actually, about the connection with tzitzit and women, who wear these tassels. And I don't know if I can pull mine, up on, this is one of my corners, and you have the 8 on each side, and then there's different numbers of knots, 7, 5, 9, 11, etc., like that. There's different traditions, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, for how many they are, and they all have different significance, and almost anyone can tie them, but it can be a beautiful mitzvah, a relatively simple one. It's also one that's about identity, meaning those who wear tzitzit are not just fulfilling a mitzvah. Those who wear it and they wear it out are saying something about themselves and about their importance of identifying a Jew in public, just like a kippah, except a kippah is not a commandment from the Torah, whereas tzitzit are. So the class will be in 2 different parts. The first one, we'll be looking at some classical commentaries where the rabbis try and explain what's, the importance of tzitzit and what are they supposed to accomplish. And the second one is a very interesting question. I'll talk more about it when we get there, about why tassels? Why tassels? Why hanging strings from the hem of your robe? And again, I was actually looking for images for, classical, biblical, and all the images were of a tallis that you could find today in any synagogue. So it doesn't mean that we did not wear them thousands of years ago, but a lot of that stuff probably disintegrated over time. So I wasn't able to find an image of what these tassels would have looked like thousands of years ago, because if I did, that's probably what we'd be wearing today. But it was more likely that people were wearing long, not flowy, but long robes, probably similar to Bedouins today in the Middle East. And at the bottom of them, they would have put some sort of tassels. But again, we'll come back to that. So the first place to start, Susan, I will go ahead and unmute you and welcome Jane. And first, we'll just look at the actual mitzvah. So this is from this week's parasha of Shelach, and here God is describing the mitzvah of tzitzit. So please.
Okay, all right. God spoke to Moses, telling him, speak to the Israelites and have them make tassels or tzitzit on the corners of their garments for all generations. They shall include a twist of sky blue wool in the corner tassels. These shall be your tassels, and when you see them, you shall remember all of God's commandments so as to keep them. You will then not stray after your heart and eyes, which in the past have led you to immorality. You will thus remember and keep all my commandments and be holy to your God. I am God, your Lord, who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am God, your Lord.
Excellent, thank you. So there's a lot of beautiful things happening here. There's also I'll say a big gap, but there's a jump between what's written here in the text and then how the mitzvah kind of plays out today. It says the corners of your garments. Today, the ruling, the halakha, the law is that Tzitzit are only obligated upon a four-cornered garment. So something has two corners, that's not considered a garment. There's a question, what about five corners? A lot of things the Torah doesn't explicitly say, but there was clearly some sort of garment-related thing. Now, the rabbis do talk a lot about the importance of garments and what they say about us, and we will come back to that at the end. But another thing to point out in the end, it repeats over and over again where God says, I am God, and the Torah doesn't explain why. Some mitzvot it says that, some it doesn't. One hypothesis is that when it says, I am the Lord your God over and over again, it's because it's connected to a mitzvah that doesn't necessarily make logical sense, that people may, not take as seriously. They may not do unless you have this extra oomph from God. So clearly, I don't say clearly, but it appears that this is a particularly important mitzvah, and we're going to see the rabbis pick up on that. The other thing is the word tzitzit, translated here as tassels. And again, whether or not tassels is the best translation, clearly something hangs down from their clothes at the corners. Whether it's a bunch of strings like I wear, or it's something else, is not entirely clear. And there's some African cultures that wear different kinds of robes that have things like tassels hanging down. Is that what the Israelites wore? Some variation of it? We don't know exactly, but some strings hanging down. But the other really important thing, which won't be our main focus today, is that there was one string called techelet. Techelet was a kind of bluish purple color, often associated with royalty. We do not know precisely what the color was, but we have a pretty good guess. But for any of you who have walked into a synagogue and seen all of the talitot hanging up, they don't have that blue string anymore. And I've given a class on why we don't have it anymore, because we lost the tradition of it. There's questions about doing it right. And many, particularly in Israel, are like, well, that's silly. We looked at the sources and we know exactly what it is. Why aren't you doing it? And that gets into a question, a bit of tradition. We haven't done it for so long, and we don't like changing things. It's very Jewish. So those are the basic components of the mitzvah. And now we'll look at a couple of classical rabbinical sources, digging a little bit more into it. And one line that they're going to pick up on is that when you see them, you shall remember all of God's commandments. How is looking at string going to make you remember hundreds and hundreds of commandments? So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and zoom in a wee bit more. And Gloria, if you could take this source from the Talmud, go ahead. So the source number 2 from the Talmud. Oh, sorry. Before you take this one I forgot that I put it this early. One of the things in preparing for this class, as I was like, I think this is interesting, but it's unfair because a lot of students, people that might hear this, are women, and they might think, well, that's interesting, Rabbi, but this doesn't connect to me at all. Women don't wear tzitzit. So I already knew that women can wear tzitzit, a talit katan or a talit gadol, and an Ashkenazim, they can say the blessing. But there's the whole, they're exempt from it. However, if one actually looks through the sources of the Talmud, which I reviewed them and had some other sources help guide me, the majority of the sources in the Talmud actually say that women are equally obligated. And in fact, if you look here, this is the source here for the 2nd century. Go ahead, take it, this quick one, Gloria.
Rav Yehuda would affix white and sky blue strings to the garment, persuma, of his wife. And every morning he would recite the blessing, to wrap ourselves in garments with ritual fringes.
Yeah, his wife in his house, all the women in his household, this persuma, this garment or apron or whatever it was, but women would wear tzitzit. And if you took a box and you put all the rabbis who think that women are equally obligated in wearing tzitzit on their clothes, and those who are opposed, you're going to have everybody on this side, and you're going to have one rabbi from, I think, the 1st century, I think Rabbi Shimon, who thinks not that women cannot do it, but they are exempt from it. Now, for whatever reason, we don't know, that became the popular thing, particularly in the medieval ages. And you actually see some rabbis saying that there are still women who wear tzitzit as an obligation, and they're fools. Why? I don't know. I don't know if that was because there was a backlash against women in general and their roles in religion, if that was a reaction to medieval mores and theology and the connection of women and religion. But it's quite explicit in the Talmud that women are equally obligated. Now, that does not mean that I'm expecting everyone on this class and listening to this class, women, to start wearing tzitzit, but rather saying that from the perspective of the Torah and God, this mitzvah and everything behind it, God intended it, or at least the real classic rabbinic understanding is that this was for women as well. So whether or not experientially this will connect with women equally. I imagine it won't as much because women don't wear tzitzit as much, but that's the intention behind this mitzvah. Our understanding is that it is meant to speak to women equally, and I hope that that enhances some of these ideas, even if women still choose not to wear it, as the practical ruling today is that women are exempt. So thank you for that, Gloria. But now we're going to get into just a few sources that talk about the importance of this mitzvah, and the rabbis really just go all in on it. So Leonard, if you would take source number 3, and this is a fairly early midrash, 1st century. A lot of the sources in this particular collection are associated with the great Rabbi Akiva, but the actual collection itself, parts of it have been lost, it's been reconstructed, but it's probably around 1st century common era. So go ahead, Leonard, please.
The commandments of tzitzit is as important as all other commandments together. And he who regularly wears tzitzit is considered as if he observed all the commandments.
That's quite a big statement. If somebody wears tzitzit, that's it. It's like they've done all of the other mitzvot. Now, there are a number of rabbinic commentaries who kind of dig into this because it doesn't this midrash doesn't explain itself. But it kind of goes back to that line about somebody who sees the tzitzit. God says, you will see them and you will remember all of my mitzvot. So what it's saying is that even if somebody's not doing everything, as long as they're consciously thinking of doing them all, the meaning that intentions actually do matter. And as long as someone is, and again, if somebody who's thinking about the mitzvot is not going to be going around eating pork and killing people, maybe they won't have an opportunity to actually do everything. But by constantly thinking of them, being reminded of them, they are still connected, both psychologically and spiritually, to all of the mitzvot. So this statement shouldn't necessarily be taken literally, but the rabbis repeat it a lot, both through midrashic, Talmudic statements, and throughout history about how mitzvot is the biggest one, specifically because God said in the Torah, if you see it, you'll be reminded of all of them. And that memory, the rabbis say, will ultimately lead to action. So again, it's not the same as actually doing all the other mitzvot, but it is, it leads to them, and therefore it has that great importance. Susan, yeah, go ahead, please. Just got to unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
I just thought of this. There are people who will wear a tie a string around their finger to help them remember something, and because they look at their hand, why do I have this string on my finger? Yes, it's because I was going to, pick up the dry cleaning. Or whatever.
It's so funny you say that. One of the commentaries I didn't bring here, again from a classical rabbi, was talking about the string around the finger, and they were saying people put the string around the finger and they look at it and they forget, why did I try this string? And he says, but it's a similar idea to tzitzit, except for tzitzit they look at it and they'll immediately remember, I put on tzitzit to remember the mitzvot. So it's actually a more powerful, concrete way to remember all of the mitzvot, whereas the string, we might do it to go to the store or something like that, we'll forget, but tzitzit has one consistent, constant meaning. So it's beautiful that you brought that up.
Well,
I just didn't bring it
yeah,
up.
I just wonder if this is where it came from. But since I just mentioned dry cleaning,
yes,
there's the old joke about the dry cleaner who had trouble dry cleaning the tzitzit because there were all these knots in the corners and it took them forever to untie all the knots.
Yes, I've heard.
I know the story.
I do, and I had someone, I don't know if she was joking,
Okay.
but an old a friend of mine, and she's not Jewish, and we're in the elevator, and she saw my tzitzit, and she's like, "Oh, Rabbi, let me get some scissors and let me cut those off." I don't know if she was serious at the time, but I stopped her quite quick. So this next source here, and by the way, the section in the Talmud Menachot, which actually usually deals with flour sacrifices, like matzah and challah, et cetera, like that. 43b is where a lot of these conversations happen, but this one I mentioned is seeing leads to memory and memory leads to action. So that's how the rabbis explain why it's so important, because first you have to think of the thing before you actually do it. And the last thing that, again, this is just kind of a brief cursory look at some of these things, and Jane, I'll have you take this, is that blue string. What's the importance of the blue string, and how does that play into it? Why is blue significant in that? And there's two answers, one from the Talmud, and then I'll mention the other one. Go ahead, please, Jane.
It was taught, Rav Meir said, why was Techelet singled out from all the other colors? Because Techelet resembles the sea, and the sea resembles the heavens, and the heavens resemble God's throne.
So this is the classical answer. Why the blue string? Because when we see it, we'll think of basically go through this series of things and get to God's throne. Now that doesn't mean that God actually has legs and a tuchus to sit down on it, but there's imagery throughout the Torah that there are some physical things, or at least images of physical things in the Torah that we call God's throne, and they are blue. So ultimately it reminds us, it puts us in a sense of awe of God. Now, again, the Torah doesn't tell us this. It just says you'll remember. What are we going to remember, and what are the things we're looking at? So these are kind of the main ideas that the rabbis run with, and then commentaries for the next 1,500 years all basically play off of what you just saw here, whether it's rabbis mentioning the string around the finger and connecting that experience, or talking about the things that blue represents, but that's what the rabbis stick with. But there's one other big question, and that's what I want to focus on. Actually, I'll pause for a moment before we go on. Any questions just on these first three sources? Yeah, Jane, please.
What's the red string that the
Kabbalists?
The Kabbalist red string around your wrist?
So that's a much, much more recent thing, and there's not one good answer for it. It could be something from another culture. It could be something that scares away demons, but it is not based in the Torah. In fact, in classical rabbinic texts, the color red is actually, problematic. It is very atypical to go into an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood and see little girls wearing red dresses. Not that it's explicitly forbidden, but they find red to be an inappropriate color, the color of a harlot or something like that, which is, there's some truth to it. Red does have a physical effect on men. There's some studies to that, but color is very, very important in religion and in culture in general, and in advertising. But it has no basis in the Torah, and I don't know if it has any classical commentaries. I don't even know if it might be mentioned in the Zohar and some early Kabbalistic works, but nobody knows exactly that. Madonna probably knows more about it than I do, to be honest.
Okay.
But I have looked it up before, and there's no concrete, this is why it's worn. Again, it's some sort of magical thingamajigabob, goober to do something, which we have in Judaism, a mezuzah, or tefillin, in some ways are kind of an amulet, but they have a very different basis and a more concrete basis to actually do it. So the next source, and Jane, I'll just go ahead and leave you unmuted, is the question, okay, so this is what tzitzit are supposed to do, but why does it need to be strings hanging down off of our garments? Why can't it be the tefillin, which we're also doing, but why not the tefillin become the most important thing? Or why doesn't it, again, a kippah is like one of the most important things. Someone stopped me in a market and say, why do Jews wear a kippah? I said, it's a custom to help remind us that God is with us always. That's actually a more recent thing. The truth is that the idea of a head covering is shared in many other cultures, and it might be a thing of modesty. It might be because of divinity. There's a million different things. And some cultures say we shouldn't cover our head at all, so that we are bareheaded before God. So there's all kinds of different clothing that can have symbolic meaning, and there are a lot of clothing that Jews do wear, including women who there's the practice of women who are married to cover their hair. So there's a lot of different things that could have been the dress thing. Why strings hanging down? So we have a number of different classical commentaries that try to explain that. And then we're going to look at a modern one that brings a very interesting twist and something very cool that I found. So Jane, if you would take this from Yitzhak Abravanel, it comes from a very famous Portuguese family. I think they were all like rich and diplomats and doctors or something like that. So go ahead, his commentary, please, source number one here.
The verse says, be holy to your God. I am God, your Lord, to instruct us that we should be distinguished in our dress like a king's or master's servants who wear an insignia on their clothes so that we will be recognizable as servants and messengers of God.
Excellent. Now, he doesn't specifically say how tassels hanging down do that, but he's kind of getting closer to it. He's saying that Jews wear an identifying clothing item so that people know they are Jews and they are servants of God. So it might be that, if only Jews are wearing these strings hanging down and no one else is doing it, that's why we do it. Because maybe in fact, we do know in a lot of the cultures in the Middle East, people were doing head coverings similar to the Jews. People were wearing robes. Obviously that changed, but everybody else is already wearing these other clothing items. So the only one that could be unique is the tassels. And somehow these hanging down tassels are unique identifying insignia. Gloria and Leonard, I'll go ahead and unmute you again. Now we're jumping backwards in time a little bit. I didn't give an exact age because it's always a range of like several hundred years and like 4 or 5 different countries. So it's early medieval times in the lands of Ashkenaz, which are like France and that part of Europe and stuff like that. And the Tosafot brings in a very similar idea to, or brought a similar idea to the Abravanel. So go ahead, Gloria, please.
The Talmud compares tzitzit to a seal of clay used to identify a slave, because the tzitzit identified that the Jewish people are servants of God.
So again, very similar to the Abravanel. It's something when somebody sees that, so it's just like if somebody sees my kippah, they know, oh, it's a Jew. So too, when they see my tzitzit, maybe less people today, like that woman in the elevator, not everyone recognizes them, but when they see the tzitzit, they say, oh, that's a Jew. Now, the hope is they see, oh, that's a Jew, a servant of God, and then that Jew is helping an old lady cross the street or giving out charity, and they say, how beautiful are the Jewish people. Unfortunately, our identifying marks have often been more of a curse than a blessing, but ideally, they're supposed to be a blessing connecting us with God and our role and responsibility. But I want to come back to this idea of this seal of clay. Is, like, let's say like a signet ring that someone wears, like royalty, and they sign a letter by pushing that ring into a bit of melted wax. It is an explicit identifying mark that a Jew can use to identify themselves in all situation. And we'll come back to how explicit Tosafot is being. In this next source, Susan, I'm going to mute you, is from one of my favorite rabbis, Or Chaim Ibn Attar, 18th century Morocco. Did we lose you, Susan? Uh-oh, okay. So,
No.
Oh, okay. If you could take source number 3, please. Oh, you muted yourself. Just got to unmute yourself again. Okay,
Yeah,
go for it, please, Susan.
Yeah, I don't know what it was. You were kind of going in and out there, and I got disconnected. I don't know if it's me
I'm
or
so
you,
sorry.
but anyway, okay, all right. God only commanded this mitzvah for a 4-cornered garment and not for one that has 3 or 5 corners. Since tzitzit is a sign of servitude, God commanded us that the sign itself should proclaim our master, as is common among the kings of the earth. Each one has a unique insignia designated for his servants. So too, God commanded us to only use a 4-cornered garment upon which to make the insignia for him, alluding to the fact that our king is the creator of the 4 corners of the earth. Glad they don't say 4 corners of the globe, and the master over it. A 3-cornered or 5-cornered garment would miss out on this message and therefore does not require tzitzit.
Excellent, thank you. So again, oh yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Well, I had some thoughts about that. Was actually you asked before if people want to say anything, and I missed my chance, so I was writing it in the chat. But the color blue, there's a new children's book that came out a while ago that I read. It's called Blue, and subtitled something, the history of a extra special color or something. Yeah. And historically, blue dyes have been very rare and expensive. So before they discovered indigo, they would use lapis, precious stones, and this special rare dye that was only produced by this one particular species of snail or whatever.
Yeah, the Murex trunculus, they think.
Yeah. So it's really quite. It actually mentions the techelet in this book, although it kind of screws up and it says techelet is the name of the garment that Jews wear. But it's an interesting point, because once upon a time, people just wore red clothes or brown clothes or yellow clothes because those were the colors that were available in nature to dye fabric with.
And the fact that, as you pointed out, it was fairly rare. It was often associated with royalty because the average person couldn't afford it. But the fact that Jews are commanded that every Jew has to have it on all of the corners of their garments is, it's an expensive thing. It's a special thing that goes above and beyond, and that connection with royalty. And in fact, all these classical commentaries, and again, the Or HaChaim sort of summarized a lot of what we've seen about why so specific. But he said that God is the king, and God wants everyone that works for God to wear this specific uniform. And because God is a king, God should be associated with all of the trappings of royalty. Like, again, I named this section divine uniform. If you work for, the Queen of England, you can't just come into work, wearing whatever you want. You can't wear your workout gym clothes. There are specific uniforms with colors and insignia that someone sees you, they will know that you are a royal guard. And that is very important. And it raises up the guards themselves. It's a sign of respect and pride for them, but it also connects them and reminds them that they are in service of their queen and of the crown. And that's what the rabbis are saying here, is that these garments, the specific reason of tassels is because somehow it is an identifier, a known identifier, that someone is a servant of the God of the universe, God of the universe. Now, as I was compiling this, I found all these sources. I was like, oh, that's so cool. But then I was reading another article that was much more contemporary. And the article was saying, well, no rabbi has ever figured this out. The classical commentaries have never answered this question. But then I read the modern thing, and then I read these, and I was like, I don't think you read these sources, because I think that these classical commentaries actually figured it out quite well. And it's really cool to actually have what they figured out about that idea of tzitzit being an identifier of one's class and role and job, to validate those ideas. So this is an article from Professor Rabbi Marty Lokshin, and he's actually going to talk about the scholar Jacob Milgram, who we brought in the past. He passed away, I don't recall how long ago. Brilliant scholar. And I'll go ahead and take this last source. And again, as he's describing why he thinks tzitzit, based on actual things we know about the ancient Near East and the Middle East, based on that, remember now the sources that we just read through. So he says, in 1981, in an article titled The Tassel and the Talit, Jacob Milgram showed how ancient Near Eastern literature and art teach us the importance of the hem, the bottom, the corners of a garment, of a person's garment. It is an extension of its owner's person and authority. The more important the individual, the more elaborate the embroidery of his hem. Milgram draws our attention to the scene in 1 Samuel, Shmuel, when David cuts off the hem of Shaul's garment and later feels remorse for doing so, while Saul concludes, now I know that you, David, will indeed reign. What was the reason for David's remorse and for Saul's response? So this is when Saul was chasing David, and then he went into a cave to relieve himself. David was hiding in the cave, and he went over there and he cut off the bottom of Saul's hem. Why is it a big deal if you cut off someone's garment? Because he wasn't just cutting off like a little bit of sleeve or something like that. The hem of royalty. There was something about it, again, like just like I'll just say a police officer. A police officer wears a badge. That's their identifying thing. That is their significant piece on their body that identifies them for their job. Well, how does a king identify themselves? By the hem of their garment. And today you could say they identify by their crown or other things, but the hem was not just, oh, that's the bottom where they, sew it up. No, it had a significant kind of embroidery that only kings, only the colors and the designs that only kings were allowed to have. The answer rests in the meaning of the hem. It was an extension of Saul's person and authority. David felt remorse for taking it because God had not so ordered. Saul, however, regarded it as a sign from God that his authority had been transferred to David. If you take the corners of my garment, my tzitzit, then you also take my kingship. He was now cut off from the throne. So that adds a lot more meaning to that particular story. At times, hems were so unique that the impression of a hem on a document replaced the signature. Just like the signet ring pushing down into wax, they would use that. I don't know how they would do it. Maybe they would put paint or something on it and put it on a document. But thus, when Tamar demands that Judah, and this is a weird story within the Joseph narrative, with hidden identity and prostitution and everything, when Tamar demands that Judah leave with her his identification, she asks for his seal, his staff, and his patil, his cord or tassel. And what do we call the corners of the tzitzit? The patil techelet is those hanging down tassels. So she wants his tzitzis. Something about them is a significant identifier that then she can go back later, and it concludes the story where she says, this is the man who slept with me, who's the father of my child, and Tamar, I'm allowed to be with him anyways. But again, that means that tzitzit, you can use them to identify someone's position and person in society. Tzitzit are a way of extending the hem. The significance of such an elaborate hem lies in this. It was worn by those who counted. It was the idea of nobility. So this idea that's, again, proven by both cases in the Torah, but by other cultures, is that kings wore hems. If you had a role in society, you would wear a fancy hem. So God comes to God's people and says, I want everyone to identify you as my servants, for I am God the king. Just like those kings, their servants wear a special hem, this is the hem that you're going to wear. So as to the question about why specifically the hem, why the bottom, the corners of the garment, because that's what was done in the ancient world. that's how people identified what your role was, what your position was. And by the way, the fact, as Susan pointed out, that Jews wore blue, and such a fancy one, even though we are servants of God, because God is king over the entire universe, our role as servant puts us pretty high. So it's not like we're lowly, like a lowly servant who's dirt. They might wear an identifying hem, but it might be cheap, and people can say, oh, I can see from your hem that you're a servant, you're not worth much. But when they see a Jewish or an Israelite hem, they say, oh, you are a servant of the one true God. Again, unfortunately, it's been a curse, but ideally it would have been a blessing. And again, how cool is it that this more contemporary sources, even if you say it's the 1980s, but these contemporary sources line up very well with these sources going all the way back to at least the 10th or 11th century, and certainly the 15th and 18th, that the tzitzit are meant to identify us in our role as servants of the one true God. So the contemporary sources fill in some of the gaps and bring in some contemporary evidence from that time, but the rabbis figured it out fairly well. Tzitzit are something that someone looks at, that we look at them and remember the commandments, that people look at us and remember our role as those who serve God. And that's a beautiful and powerful thing. And again, as I reminded people, even though I'm not saying now women should all wear this, this is something that was equally expected of women as well. Meaning this is not meant to say, oh, only men were those who were serving God. All Israelites, men and women, are servants of God. And that is a sign and a mark of great dignity, pride, and integrity.